When you hear the term 8-bit, you probably think of the simple, blocky graphics from the first Mario, Zelda, or Pokemon games. But what exactly does 8-bit mean? A bit, or binary digit, is the smallest unit of information possible. It's either on or off, like a switch. Get 8 of these switches in a row and you can represent 256 unique states, like numbers. 8-bit machines are built around these units of 8 bits, or bytes, and this includes the graphics as well. Each byte can be read as one big number, but it can also be read as its 8 individual numbers. On the NES and Game Boy, each pixel is stored as 2 bits, giving it 4 unique states, like colors. When the graphics processor draws these pixels to the screen to render a frame, it gives each state an actual color from a corresponding color palette stored elsewhere. This way of handling graphics results in super efficient code and data, but gives these consoles their signature limitations, most obviously their 4-color tiles. Even though Super Mario Bros. And Super Mario World have the same resolution, it's the color count that makes all the difference. In the case of the original Game Boy, it was even more limited, with only 4 shades of gray at all, and 2/3 of the resolution. So with all of that in mind, how do you take this and put it onto this? Later handhelds could simply downscale images to work on the hardware, but doing the same with the Game Boy's restrictions produces some pretty rough results, at least at this scale. Increasing the card's size adds more detail, but screen space and memory is at a premium and has to share room with lots of other text and graphics. So when Hudson Soft set out to recreate the Pokemon trading card game on Game Boy, the graphic designers had to get creative. Each card's illustration is only 64 by 48 pixels wide with 4 shades of gray. And yet, despite these limitations, they were translated so faithfully and so masterfully. It's some of the best 8-bit pixel art I've ever seen, and we can learn a ton from it. But the game isn't just in black and white, of course. One of the game's programmers recalled, "When we started developing Pokemon Card GB, there was no talk of compatibility with the Game Boy Color. However, as development progressed, we heard that a Game Boy Color would be released. So we decided to create graphics that support color as well. That's why Pokemon Card GB contains 3 types of graphics, for monochrome Game Boy, Super Game Boy, and Game Boy Color. The most obvious is the whole map. The pictures of the islands are different, so you can tell at a glance when you compare them. Unlike some other assets though, the card sprites use the exact same graphics on all platforms. But the Game Boy Color also uses the card's unique color palettes, which is how they're colorized. Each palette uses a somewhat white and somewhat black color, which are saturated to various degrees depending on the context. Sometimes the white shade isn't white at all, like with most Pikachu cards. The 2 middle colors are either monochromatic, analogous, or independent from each other. That last case is interesting because it implies the cards were drawn in color first instead of being colorized later. Take Raticate for instance. In black and white, there would be no reason to reserve light gray for green and dark gray for orange. Using both shades like this would capture more detail. But in color, it doesn't work at all, and would have to be modified to use a monochrome palette. Comparing both forms of different cards is interesting, but I'll be using the color versions from now on. Now let's look at the artistic techniques and conventions used to translate the original Pokemon card illustrations into pixel art. First of all, every card has a 1 pixel wide black border, which keeps everything contained and looking sharp. Next, a color palette needs to be chosen. This will dictate how the rest of the card's elements are interpreted. The Pokemon itself is always prioritized, which usually results in a light shade and a dark shade from its palette being used. However, some cards opt for 2 contrasting colors like we saw earlier. So one color is mostly for the Pokemon and the other is mostly for the background, with the white and black colors used more extensively to compensate. This brings us to perhaps the most important technique, dithering. The most common use for dithering is to blend 2 colors together or transition between them, but dithering can also add texture, create visual interest, or maintain a small and cohesive color palette, in art with more than 4 colors at least. Dithering is honestly an art form in itself, and the graphic designers for these cards use tons of it to convey as much detail as possible. Let's start with blending 2 colors. There are many types of dither patterns, but the most basic and common is a checkerboard alternating between them. I can't find any names for these patterns, so I'm calling this one a half dither because it covers 50% of the original color. The other one they use, which I'll call a quarter dither, covers 25%. Using these two patterns, you can create 3 intermediate stages between colors like this. The quarter dithering is actually unique as it offsets every other row of pixels. This makes the transition into half dithering more complicated, but looks much more natural over larger areas especially. As a byproduct of shading, dithering can also imply texture on different types of terrain, foliage, atmosphere, anything really. Usually only half dithering is used with the Pokemon themselves though. This is mostly for visual clarity, and because quarter dithering requires a larger area to pull off. But there are some interesting exceptions to that. The last use for dithering is to avoid large areas of a single color in the more abstract cards. This adds some visual interest and helps stay consistent with the more detailed cards. The way the Pokemon are portrayed is kept pretty consistent. Their black outlines are recreated, then shading and other details are added, then the Pokemon are fully outlined in white, which really makes them pop from the background. Those backgrounds, however, are much less straightforward to interpret than the flat, cartoony monsters. Depending on the scene's complexity, elements are simplified, left out, or drawn as more symbolic outlines. From personal experience, this is the hardest part of the process, and recreating such detailed backgrounds well takes a lot of planning, creativity, and time. But there is another type of background we haven't looked at yet: holographic cards. These look awesome and are emulated pretty well, first by using the 2 darkest colors to represent the background behind the holofoil, which you can better see on the non-holo versions of the original cards. Everything is dithered to darken the pattern and give it that glittery appearance. Then those shiny stars are drawn everywhere with the 2 lighter colors. Simple but effective. Now I've stuck to talking about the Pokemon artwork, but the same principles apply to the trainer and energy cards as well. A much higher portion of these cards were originally 3D renders, and they were handled really well. Well, that should cover everything regarding the art style. Tell me if there's another design choice or technique that I missed though. I should mention that on an original Game Boy Color, the screen looked more like this. This doesn't affect any art too much, except for this Sandshrew, which is hard to even look at on a normal display. Bright yellows especially appear washed out, so you'll notice a lot of yellow palettes are overcompensating for this. But wait, there's another way you could view these cards, remember? On the Super Game Boy. Basically, the Super Game Boy has a limited ability to colorize the normally black and white screen by applying a custom color palette to it. Actually, you can apply up to 4 different palettes to different areas of tiles. However, this color layer is static and can't be scrolled, which means that any moving sections of a game have to all use one palette. But static elements like these can utilize multiple, and that's what Pokemon TCG does in its menus and duels, using the same card palettes as the Game Boy Color version. But the Super Game Boy has another quirk of making the first color in each palette transparent, which shows the background color underneath in this case. This only really affects cards that use a non-white color first, resulting in some very odd-looking sprites. But what about making cards with more than 4 colors? In the Japan-only sequel Pokemon Card GB2, each card is given 3 different color palettes, and all of the original art was recolored to utilize them. 12 colors sounds like a lot, but in practice it's a lot more restricted. Since each tile can only be assigned 1 palette, and common colors like black and white need to be shared between them, the amount of unique colors is usually more like 6 or 7. Even still, there often aren't enough palettes or enough colors in one tile to include every detail, which sometimes leads to these unwanted seams between palettes, incorrectly colored elements, or reductions in detail. But in general, the updated cards look amazing, and it'd be much harder to notice the imperfections on a real Game Boy Color. I actually tried reworking some of the cards' color palettes and lost details under the same limitations and could barely make any improvements. So yeah, the artist did a really good job. Why 3 color palettes though? Could they use more? Not really. Let's look at the game's main dual screen. Pikachu uses 3 color palettes, Abra uses another 3 palettes, text and icons use a gray palette, and these borders use an orange palette. That makes 8 palettes in total, which happens to be the maximum the Game Boy Color can use at once. So it was all very intentional. But there are ways to go even further, as anyone who's played Yu-Gi-Oh's Game Boy game will know. The art in this game is large and colorful unlike much else on the system. This is accomplished by creating a layer of sprites with their own set of sprite palettes on top of the background tiles, so more than 4 colors per tile are possible. This 7-color fish uses 7 whole background palettes and another 7 sprite palettes, 34 sprites in total. But using these massive colorful cards has its drawbacks. They're slow to load and take up a lot of screen space, and only one card can be on screen at a time, since it uses up all of the sprites and colors. This is why cards attack face down. The art for the card back only uses 1 palette shared with the text and icons. Also, Pokemon TCG uses sprites for its awesome attack animations, which Yu-Gi-Oh! Completely lacks. Anyway, this was kind of all over the place, but I hope it's interesting.